Welcome to Freedom to Learn, the podcast that champions choice in education, defends parental rights, and exposes the harm caused by school unions. I'm Jenny Gentles, Director of Education Freedom and Parental Rights at DFI, the Defense of Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm excited to have Julie Hamill on the podcast today. Julie's a California attorney, a mother, and a courageous advocate for children, as well as the founder of the Alliance of Los Angeles County Parents and the California Justice Center. She's also a frequent guest on Fox News at Night with Trace Gallagher. In this episode, we talk about the various ways Julie has been fighting against government overreach in education. We start by reflecting on the harm caused by teachers' unions' COVID-era demands, and Julie describes her legal fight against mask mandates. Julie and I also discuss the origins of gender ideology in California schools. Listeners likely know that California requires its school districts to force girls and boys to share bathrooms, locker rooms, and overnight accommodations on school field trips. California also believes children have a constitutional right to privacy from their parents and advises school districts to create separate gender identity files to conceal certain records from parents, in direct violation of federal law. We conclude our conversation with a discussion about the legal actions our organizations are taking. The Defense of Freedom Institute and the California Justice Center recently filed a Title IX federal civil rights complaint with the U.S. Department of Education and requested an investigation. Julie also sent a letter to the U.S. Department of Education detailing California's Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, or FERPA, violations. After we recorded our conversation, the federal department opened an investigation into California's concealment scheme, as Julie calls it. The department also issued a Dear Colleague letter to all states and school districts, reminding them of their FERPA obligations. Check out the links in the show notes for those exciting developments. Julie Hamill, welcome to Freedom to Learn.
Thank you for having me.
We discovered each other on social media during the COVID era. That's an era that we don't like to talk about anymore because it was hard. It was incredibly disheartening and it was eye-opening. And so a lot of us as parents across the nation have moved on in various ways. But we do have to acknowledge that it was a reality because we have the outcomes of it now. We have horrible learning loss. We have doubled chronic absenteeism. We have behavior problems, and we have truly unhealthy environments in schools. So I just wanted to start our conversation by saying thank you. I was so grateful to find you on social media back then. It felt lonely fighting what we were fighting with the school closures and the mask mandates and all the insanity around lockdown. So I just appreciated that across the country, there were these voices like yours who were willing to take it on. How do you think you had the courage to do that? Because I'm sure in your community like mine, it was a controversial position to take.
I'm also grateful for you, and I'm grateful for everyone that I found during that time because I was incredibly lonely and isolated here. And I don't look at it as a courageous act. For me, it was an act of desperation from a desperate woman who had nothing to lose, watching my children suffer because of government policy that I knew could change. We can change the policy and we can end the suffering that our children are experiencing. I kept trying to appeal to people in my circles. I was in this group called Law Mamas, which has gained infamy on social media and in the press at some point, because it was this group of like 10,000 progressive women lawyers who it started out as this really supportive group where we were helping each other with our careers and raising children with being attorneys. And then it turned into this progressive, woke, radical bubble, which was completely intolerant of any sort of non-radical leftist viewpoint. And in that group, I had started what I thought was a completely innocent and common sense ask. This is LA County 2020 and 2021. And I started suggesting ways that we could convert our elementary schools into childcare centers, because under the law, childcare centers were allowed to be open and in person, whereas schools could not. And that was because of the unions pushing the policies. When I made that suggestion, I was excoriated. I was called a racist. I was called a grandma killer, all sorts of names. And that was sort of my first foray into what the heck is going on. Like I really truly believed that I was proposing something very common sense that would help end the suffering of my own children and other people's children. but it was not acceptable to say that. And so for a while I receded and I did not say anything publicly. I simply quietly pulled my children and I put them into a private childcare facility that was open in our area. And they were able to attend school. They were masked, but they were able to go in person and sort of make these social connections that they were really lacking. At the time, my oldest was 5. I don't think I was very courageous. I think after having my kids go into that public program and then seeing that the schools were not changing and that the mindsets weren't changing even after a year had gone by, and it was very clear, we have all of these kids attending childcare programs. They're not dying. The kids are not dying. They're not being hospitalized generally. And I knew that the statistics we were being fed in the media and online were really blown out of proportion. And so finally in the fall of 2021 is when I decided I can no longer handle this. I am not going to play along. I'm not going to wear my mask outside. I'm not going to feed into this crazy mindset that's really hurting our children. And I think one of the triggers for me for finally reaching that point was I went to Florida for my sister-in-law's bachelorette party.
I spent a lot of time in Florida. It was really confusing for my kids when they would see children walking home from school in my parents' neighborhood.
And it breaks my heart. It makes me want to cry. I mean, thinking it was completely normal. Like I got out of the plane in Miami and it was like, I walked into an alternate reality and seeing people live that way. And then coming back to LA, and I remember walking into the mall, Del Almo Mall, when I returned to LA, and it was like zombie land. There were almost no people out. The people there were all covered in N95 masks. Everybody was scared. No one was looking at each other. So at that point, I knew I had to say something because I knew a lot of kids were suffering and people were too afraid to say anything. Yeah. And I had lost my ability to work. I've been self-employed for a long time, but I couldn't work when my kids didn't have childcare. And so I really didn't have a corporate career to lose. And I know other people did. And so I started speaking out and I just simply spoke the truth. That's all I did. I did nothing brave or courageous. I just said what I was thinking and what I was seeing. And that really resonated with people. And I think that moved the needle and enabled other people to have the courage to also speak up and share their points of view and share what they were seeing and experiencing with their own children.
It's definitely true that courage is contagious and also very reassuring because you can be thinking, well, gosh, am I crazy to be speaking up? I sense that something really wrong's happening here and the outcomes are going to be bad. And I worked in education policy. I knew what I was talking about, that we shouldn't be having these prolonged school closures, that we shouldn't be socially isolating kids, and that we shouldn't be covering children's and the adults around them's faces up so that they don't learn how to form sounds and words. And so that's an action that you took beyond just tweeting op-eds. You sued, right?
Yeah, I did. I think I was driven mad, honestly, by the government. I couldn't believe, first of all, that the government had that much power that they could lock us in our homes and keep our kids out of school and force people to wear coverings over their mouths. I ended up getting kicked out of the childcare facility that my kids were attending in the winter of 2022 because I could not comply with the outdoor mask order that they had. It wasn't even a county order. It was from the school. It was a directive. You have to wear your mask at all times, outside, inside. I could no longer do it. So I was
kicked out. And we're 2 years into the pandemic at this point.
So I was kicked out of that school. I was kicked out of my child's basketball league because I took this stand. I couldn't do it anymore. It was so crazy to me that we had to keep doing something we knew wasn't working and was harming kids. So that was the winter. When I started getting kicked out of everything, I started getting really active and I did a press conference with Human Hamati, who's now a good friend of mine. He's a physician, and a couple of other people. We met at this press conference. Of course, nobody ran any of the stories. We were protesting the Super Bowl coming to LA when we were under this crazy mandate. the county thought it was okay to bring in 75 million people to watch the Super Bowl, but kids couldn't go to school without wearing a mask at all times. We started protesting. We were going to sue then. And my theory was we were going to try to enjoin the Super Bowl. We were going to try to prevent the Super Bowl from taking place because based on the County Department of Public Health's recommendations, it was way too deadly and dangerous to do something like that. But we decided that wasn't going to be a good PR move. So we didn't do that. And then we waited. We waited until July of 2022 when Barbara Ferrer, who's the director of the LA County Department of Public Health, decided to reissue a universal mask mandate before the kids went back to school in the fall of 2022. Long story short, we had county physicians in one of the hospitals doing these internal town halls, and they were on YouTube, but they were unlisted. Someone started feeding those links to me where the county's top physicians were saying, we are not seeing people dying from COVID at this point. So a universal mask mandate doesn't make any sense from a medical standpoint. So I took all of that information. I put that side by side with what Barbara Ferrer was saying, which was the exact opposite. And we filed a petition for writ of mandate to prohibit this arbitrary and capricious mandate from taking effect. We threatened to move for a TRO the moment she issued the mandate. She backed down. So she didn't implement this new mandate. That was a victory for us. That case turned into a free speech lawsuit that went on for about a year and a half. Very long story, but it's been quite an interesting ride.
Julie, most of us aren't highly skilled lawyers and wouldn't know that that's even an option, the path that you took. So again, thank you for doing that. You mentioned the teachers' unions when we first started talking about this. Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about the role that the unions played in all that unfolded in that era.
This issue really breaks my heart and keeps me awake at night. Before COVID, I had this very naive and sort of rose-colored glasses perspective on education. I was so excited for my kids to go to our public schools in Palos Verdes. It seemed like such a magical place. I had no idea what was really going on behind the scenes and underneath the surface. And what I learned in my advocacy for kids during COVID was that the teachers' unions were driving the policies. And the first indication to me of that was we could send our kids to school in our public school facilities. They could go and sit in a classroom on Zoom with a childcare provider watching them. They could do that, but they couldn't go to that same classroom with those same kids with a teacher teaching. Why? There was no logical justification for that. The only reason was that the unions wanted it. The unions lobbied for the school closures, and the unions argued to keep the schools closed for as long as possible. And Randy Weingarten, who's the head of one of the national teachers unions, came out, I think last week, to try and pretend that she was really advocating for schools to reopen because she knew that the outcomes would be bad. That is the most dishonest, unbelievable thing I think I've ever heard anyone say in this whole fiasco. She was on TV constantly fear-mongering, trying to keep schools closed. They had die-ins. Do you remember the protests where they had teachers out in the streets and they had coffins and parades saying that they were going to be killed because of kids coming to school and having to be in the classroom?
Yeah, the unions would have their members write draft obituaries and mail them to leaders who dared suggest that schools should open.
Yeah. And then locally, we had Cecily Myert Cruz, who is still the head of UTLA, which is the Los Angeles Unified School District Teachers Union. And she, I can't remember if it was an op-ed or an interview where she said something along the lines of, it doesn't matter that our babies didn't learn times tables or the alphabet.
I've got the quote here. There's no such thing as learning loss. Our kids didn't lose anything. It's okay that our babies may not have learned all their times tables. They learned resilience. They learned survival. They learned critical thinking skills. I'm not sure where they were picking these things up. They learned the difference between a riot and a protest. They know the words insurrection and coup.
I mean, my body rejects listening to that statement from her. It's really upsetting. And I think it just sort of perfectly summarizes what happened. You had people like Cecily Myrick Cruz, who does not care one lick about our children. And they used this pandemic for their own purposes. I remember UTLA presented a whole list of demands that they had to LAUSD in order to reopen the schools. And it was all these radical political moves that had nothing to do with education at all. And so they drove the pandemic response. And when I deposed Barbara Ferrer, the director of LA County Public Health, she kept making reference to, we always ran our decisions by our labor partners. We consult our labor partners in everything we do. The labor partners were the teachers' unions, and they drove that entire pandemic response policy.
Yeah, unless people think that the demands that they had for reopening were related to education, they were things like new taxes for the rich, Medicare for all, defunding the police.
Yes.
Those are the sort of demands that they were making in order to go along with reopening schools.
And by the way, they did defund the LA police. They removed police from LA Unified Schools, and now there are multiple deaths and mass violence on their campuses because they defunded their police.
Virginia, in the area where I live, is surprisingly similar to California. I think some people might not realize that about Northern Virginia, but same thing for my school district. They pulled the school resource officers out, which only harms the educators who are there in an unsafe environment, so the teachers union members, and then, of course, the students. You formed a group called the Alliance of Los Angeles County Parents. Was that during this era?
Yes, that was the first iteration of it, was when we were protesting the Super Bowl coming and bringing 75 million people in, when our toddlers were masked for 8 hours a day. That's when we first came together and decided we needed to organize and take action.
And then you currently lead the California Justice Center. So is the California Justice Center an outgrowth of your work during this era, the realizations that you had about government encroachment on personal freedom?
Pretty much, yes. So what happened was the California Policy Center, which is a nonprofit in California, they were also part of my awakening. I remember when I was very confused in 2020, I did not understand what was going on and what was driving the policy. I came across a few of their op-eds, I think in the Orange County Register, from one of their fellows. And then I found Will Swaim, who's the president of the California Policy Center, and the things that he was writing were the only thing that made sense to me at the time. It explained the union's role in these reopening policies. It explained what was going on and how the unions drive policy and law in California. And then a light bulb went off in my head, and I realized, oh my gosh, this is what's going on. This is how things operate here. And so I started working with California Policy Center. They wanted to open a justice center because they are a think tank and they want to be more of a do tank. And so they wanted me to create a justice center to litigate, to help fight for these principles of individual liberty, empowering individuals, fighting back against government overreach, and fighting for constitutional government.
One of the things that we want to talk about, I guess kind of the primary thing that we want to talk about, is the fact that the organization where I work, Defense of Freedom Institute, and the California Justice Center have come together to jointly file a federal civil rights complaint against the California Department of Education and multiple school districts in California. We'll need to kind of walk through, I think, what a federal civil rights complaint is, and then what you're hoping to see out of that. But before we do that, tell us what's going on in California when it comes to Title IX violations and gender ideology in the schools.
Sure. So in 2013, the California State Legislature passed AB 1266. This law amended the Education Code and created this new subsection, Education Code Section 221.5F. And in that subsection, it essentially says schools must allow students to use the facilities and play on the sports teams that align with their gender identity. instead of their sex.
Gender ideology clearly hit California early.
California is the birthplace of all of the radical policies that we see in our country. That's why it's so important to fight in California, because this is ground zero for radical policy.
Ground zero. And then there's the saying, when California sneezes, the rest of the country catches a cold. So it's not going to stay contained in California. It is going to spread. Yeah.
Exactly.
And it did when we're talking about gender ideology. Okay. So this was passed in 2013. And then what does that look like at a school? Well,
so what happened was this education code, this AB 1266 and the surrounding policy, the Biden administration took this and created that new Title IX regulation during the Biden era. It was 2023 or 2024 when they adopted the final rule. And so, as I'm sure your listeners know, Title IX is a federal statute that provides equality, equal opportunities for men and women, girls and boys in educational programs that are federally funded. There's supposed to be equal rights, equal access, and that is based on biological sex. It's a very, very important thing. And so this was intended to give girls and women opportunities in education and educational programs that they had not previously had. And so that Biden Title IX rule, which mirrored California's law, turned Title IX on its head. And it said, instead of biological sex, now we're going to base these equal opportunities on your gender identity. And as a result of that, they are allowing males to participate in girls' sports and girls' scholarship programs and educational programs that were supposed to be for girls and women. And so, thankfully, multiple federal lawsuits were filed, and in every single case that had a ruling, the courts ruled against Biden's Title IX rule, saying that this is exactly the opposite. It subverts the purpose of Title IX. And so what we have in California, which we've had for over a decade now, is this law and this policy framework that subverts the purpose of Title IX. It flies in the face of the statutory language of Title IX and the purpose of Title IX, which was to provide these opportunities to girls and women. It's now basically removed the girls category and allowed males to compete and to win and to do whatever they want as long as they identify as a girl or a woman.
Okay, so we talk about protecting women's sports a lot. We talk about protecting women's privacy when it comes to locker rooms. There have long been discussions around bathrooms. Where should students who identify as something other than their biological sex go to the bathroom? This federal civil rights complaint looked at overnight accommodations. What does it really mean when you're talking about accommodating this idea of a gender identity that's separate from biological reality? Set aside the sports for a little while, set aside the changing in a locker room for a little while. Let's talk about overnight trips that schools take. And then what happens when you have a policy like California?
This has been going on for a while, and I'm horrified that I didn't realize it until recently when a friend of mine sent me a letter that her school had sent to all of the fourth grade parents. This is in Capistrano Unified School District in Orange County. It's one of the biggest school districts in California. So this letter of interest goes out for PALI, which is an overnight science camp that fifth graders do up and down California. It's a fun tradition. It's common practice. Almost everyone who's gone through California schools has done this fifth grade overnight science camp. So PALI is one of these organizations that hosts the science camp. In this letter of interest that went out to parents on the back side, and I don't have it in front of me, so I'm paraphrasing from memory, but it said things like, "We cannot tell you the biological sex of the staffer or of the other cabin mates that will be rooming with your child overnight. But what we can tell you is that they will primarily identify as the same gender as your child."
Okay, primarily.
Primarily.
It'll mostly be females or mostly be males, primarily.
And you're not allowed to ask, and we can't tell you because that would be discrimination. So send your fifth grade girl to this camp. She may or may not be rooming with a man, who identifies as a female, but we can't tell you. There are a number of reasons why that's not going to work. Primarily, let's use our common sense. Nobody wants their young daughter to be sleeping overnight with members of the opposite sex, especially an adult. But then there are religious concerns. I know that it's against certain religions to have co-ed sleepovers, and certain religions don't acknowledge that a person who identifies as the opposite sex actually is the opposite sex. Regardless of how badly some people want everyone to believe that, there are people, myself included, who do not believe that a man can turn into a woman. I believe that your biological sex is immutable. And I think I'm not in the minority in that position.
You're not in the minority. Polling is definitely showing that if we broaden back to the Title IX women's sports issue, that has now become an 80-20 issue. When the question is, should men who identify as transgender compete in women's sports? The answer is no. So imagine if you just asked it in a straightforward way, should men compete in women's sports? Of course, the answer is no. It'd be more than 80. As we're asking questions, should they be in women's spaces? That's a big no as well. And so President Trump responded to that position that the country has. There was a keeping men out of women's sports executive order early in the administration. There also was a defending women from gender ideology extremism and restoring biological truth to the federal government executive order on January 20th. So day one, executive order. People think, I think innocently, hey, we can say what we want on Twitter. We have these very clear executive orders. We have a Dear Colleague letter on Title IX on what it means to this current administration. We had the former rule that was attempted for Title IX under the Biden administration vacated by 2 federal courts, I think. That era is over. So they might think, how could California think that they could get away with this?
California is a really special place. I grew up here and I was a child in the 80s and the 90s in California, and it was magical. But since then, we have been taken over by a supermajority Democrat legislature and a Democrat governor. We have had this supermajority for a very long time, and there's been no meaningful debate in the legislature. They shut down anyone that's not on the radical left. They are cutting microphones in the state legislature. They do not allow any sort of rational common sense positions to be shared. And so now they've doubled and tripled down on this position that's really, really radical. And nobody in the legislature, none of the Democrats are willing to push back and jeopardize their potential advancement within the party. So this really radical element has pushed California Democrats almost off a cliff. Like, they are so far to the left, you can't get any further left. And it doesn't make any sense. But recently, our governor decided to appropriate $25 million to Trump-proof California. And so we are spending my tax dollars to fight all of these executive orders and Trump's positions, which frankly are all common sense positions that most Californians support. But the radical leftist legislature and our radical governor are intent to fight back. And so I know we've got this federal civil rights complaint. It's an administrative process pending right now with the federal government. My assumption is that this is going to result in litigation. I don't see California voluntarily agreeing to change these policies, although that would be in everyone's best interest. I think it's going to require litigation, unfortunately.
So what are we hoping with this federal civil rights complaint? What is a federal civil rights complaint?
So the federal civil rights complaint is filed with the Office of Civil Rights within the United States Department of Education. And we are bringing something to the federal government's attention. We're saying these policies violate this federal statute, these regulations, your executive order. Please investigate. And so right now, the OCR department, the Office of Civil Rights, is evaluating whether or not to open an investigation. It's like a preliminary stage. And then hopefully they will open the investigation and they will ask each of the named districts and the California Department of Education, who's also named, for documents, information, and then they will come up with a finding, a notice of violation if the districts and the department have been found to violate Title IX, which I hope will be the result. And then there are opportunities to have a voluntary settlement. There are certain different remedies that can occur. But I'm just, at this point, I'm not confident, even though our own governor, Gavin Newsom, publicly stated that allowing men to compete in women's sports is deeply unfair. That is a quote. He's only saying that because he wants to be president and he wants to appear moderate to the masses in the United States. I don't think that he has the stones to actually push his party in California to a position of sanity and common sense. I just don't see it happening. I do think that it's possible for districts like Capistrano, which I believe has a sane majority now. I do believe that they can voluntarily change their policies to ensure that they align with Title IX. So that is a potential outcome there.
And the other school districts that were named, LA, San Francisco.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And then Capistrano is Orange County. So we can hope something happens in Orange County. I don't know about the other two, though,
yes,
right?
I am hopeful that Capistrano will voluntarily work with the government to amend its policies so that it is in compliance with Title IX. And if this complaint didn't exist and they did that on their own, like if a school district says we're going to align with Title IX and we're going to stop enforcing 221.5F, then those districts are risking losing state funding. Federal funding really is about only 10% of most districts' budgets. And so California school districts are in a really difficult position right now, absent some sort of federal intervention. If they voluntarily change their policies and base these things on biological sex, they are jeopardizing state funding, which is really problematic.
Okay, but I've been hearing about this term supremacy clause in reference to the Constitution.
Yes.
So if you're at the local and state level and thinking, well, which should I do? Should I follow the state law or should I follow the federal law that conflicts with the state law? Like constitutionally, what should they do?
Oh my gosh. I'm not going to give legal advice because I know this is going to end up in litigation. I don't want to be responsible for the legal bills, but I do think we're going to see a showdown between the conflict between federal and state law. And I think I do believe we're going to see some school districts throw state law aside and say, we are going with federal law. We're going to comply with Title IX. And I think that our state will go after them. I think Rob Bonta and Tony Thurmond and Gavin Newsom will go after districts who decide to comply with federal law. And I cannot predict what the outcome is going to be, but I do know based on my observations and experience that our state is crazy enough to fight to the death on this issue.
They're not just doing this with this overnight center with various Title IX violations when it comes to gender ideology and ignoring biological sex and reality. There's also a law in California that seems to be a huge FERPA violation. So we need to have a whole separate episode on what's going on with, what do you call it? The concealment scheme that this has resulted in California. But can you give us a teaser and then we'll get back together later this year and talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. I'm trying to make a long story short. This also arises from AB 1266 in 2013 because the state came up with these FAQ guidelines surrounding Ed Code 221.5F. And part of that was create dummy files and keep them separate from the student's education records, and do not tell the parents, absent the child's consent, that they are transitioning at school. And long story short, there's been a lot of litigation over this. The state's position is that kids have a constitutional right of privacy from their parents and a confidential relationship between students and school personnel. That flies in the face of the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution and all kinds of principles and Supreme Court authority. But that's the state's position. they were checkmated basically by Chino in a lawsuit. And then the legislature cooked up AB 1955, which is essentially a codification of their FAQs for AB 1266. That's being litigated in at least 3 different cases, one of which is Mirabelli versus Olson. It's a really, really important case. Paul Jonah is the attorney. If you haven't spoken with him, I highly recommend it. He is fascinating to talk to, and he just deposed the state on all of these issues. So he's got a lot of really good stories.
And so you have pointed out the fact that this conflicts with federal law. I mentioned FERPA. So
right. I'm sorry. And FERPA is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. And there is a clause in FERPA that says essentially any district that has a policy of withholding records from a parent pertaining to their child shall not receive federal funds. That's a violation of FERPA. FERPA allows parents of kids who are under 18 full access to their educational records. California's law and policy flies in the face of that and directs districts to conceal educational records and withhold them from parents. That is a violation of FERPA. And that is what I wrote about in my letter to the United States Department of Education.
Okay, so multiple things pending at the Department of Education. You are letting them know what's going on in California, and we are hoping to see action and pressure put on school districts, put on the state. And that's essential, as you're saying, because California is not going to do it on its own.
Yes. Please help us.
Well, Julie, sorry to take us back to those dark days of the COVID closures and the mask mandates. But again, it's so important to realize how we got here when we're looking at these academic outcomes and students, just a whole generation really struggling on a number of fronts. It didn't just happen. There were intentional, callous, essentially cruel policies driven by the teachers' unions that led to this result. And I don't want people to forget that. And I don't want anything like that to ever happen again. So grateful for all that you did to fight back, and also for what you're doing to tackle gender ideology and what's happening, not just in California, but in states and school districts across the country.
Well, thank you so much for doing this and for reminding people of what happened, because I think my own brain shuts down and I don't want to think about it, but it's really important for historical purposes so we don't repeat the same mistakes in the future.
Right. And so that the teachers' unions don't control the narrative as they try to rewrite their role and what happened, which is certainly something that we're seeing now. How can people follow your work?
You can find me on Twitter or X at Hamill_law. The California Justice Center is online. It's justiceca.com.
Julie Hamill, thank you for all that you do to protect parental rights. And thank you for joining Freedom to Learn.
Thank you for having me.
Freedom to Learn is a production of the Defense of Freedom Institute. You can learn more about DFI at dfipolicy.org. If you have feedback or suggestions for future podcasts, please reach out to us at podcast@dfipolicy.org. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe and leave a rating and review wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.